Welcome, everybody, to episode 8 of His and Her Life Hacks podcast. My name is Dawne.
And I'm Larry.
And today's topic, we're going to talk about something that's very interesting, something that most people don't know about or talk about, I think, unless you're in psychology or you're in that area of business. But today we're going to talk about something called the origin stories. And origin stories is really, when you think back to your childhood, it's really where the first wound impacts you. So it could be, most of the time it happens in your formative years. But then there's primary wounds, secondary wounds. So we all have them, every single one of us. We don't come out of this lifetime unscathed, but we absolutely have something that impacted us, and whether it was trauma or just something that was a major impact in our life. So that basically creates or forms a blueprint in your life. And then from there, we then tend to, it just quietly stays within us unconsciously. So some of those examples would be, parental abuse, neglect, alcoholic families, workaholic families, absent parents, mentally, physically, emotionally.
Trauma that you experience. Maybe it's a car accident that alters your life. Could be you're adopted. Right?
Yeah.
So it's the different things that typically happen, like you said, when you're young, and ultimately help form that blueprint.
And so then these wounds travel with you and they become your story. And, now fast forward, in our adult years, we have the ability to change our story at any time. We don't have to carry something that we don't want. We have the ability to change that and create that new origin story. So we were going to describe some of our experiences, maybe our stuff. I know we already talked about my story, and I'll just do high level, but Larry's going to share some of his and see if it resonates.
Well, the thing I really love about this topic, too, is so we've lived it. We've experienced it up to the point of resolution, which we'll talk about. But I never knew what origin story was. But ultimately, when you go through that process and you heal yourself, and then finding out later what it all meant, it's actually a pretty amazing revelation. But for me, it as far back as I can remember, from the youngest point of my childhood, I always remember being unsettled and feeling anxious. And it was just innate. It was part of who I was. And, my story, so to speak, so I was adopted. So I was given up for adoption and adopted into a family. And although I knew from the earliest I could ever remember, I was told by my parents that I was adopted. And I always thought that was neat and unique and pretty cool. To the young mind, at some point you have to reconcile that somebody still chose to give you up for adoption, right? So there was that, I'm sure. And then there was also, I was adopted into a family, that we just weren't close. The family certainly provided for us. I had 2 older siblings. They were 5 and 6 years older than me, Marion and Joe. And, there was a gap, and they were
also adopted.
They were also adopted. Yeah. And there was a gap in years, and so they were off doing their things. And, I was kind of left on my own, figuring this out. And, I didn't have a relationship with my father, and I can probably count on one hand, the number of meaningful conversations I had with him. Now, I need to also give his, a little bit of his story. So, he grew up on a farm out in Wisconsin, and had to leave school, drop out of school in 8th grade to then go work on the farm. And then a number of years later, short while later, he ends up going into the military, into the Marines, and he's fighting in World War II. He fought in the South Pacific. He was actually on the island of Iwo Jima the day they raised the flag, which is a pretty awesome story, right? But that took a major toll on him, which I found out a lot more later, right? In terms of him just reconciling that and recovering from those experiences and the trauma of that. But the way it showed up is he was reclusive. He just did his provider thing, but then he kind of, moved away, or went into the basement at night, and there wasn't conversation. He didn't do things with us as a family. So, for me, how that showed up for me was I always felt like I wasn't worthy. I always felt like I had to prove myself, that I wasn't good enough, and always kind of searching. And so, that's how I believe my origin story, from the very beginning kind of originated, and how it showed up in me. And ultimately we'll talk about how it ended up in our adulthood, but.
Yeah. And so that story about your father is huge, because, when you get to your adult life and then you look back and you come to terms with where you are in life, and maybe you've done some work and healing and stuff, and then this is presented to you, it really does connect all the dots. And so it's really easy for me to see when I'm coaching somebody, where their pain is or stems from, because 99% of the time it comes from your childhood. And you could have the perfect life, the perfect childhood, everything, but maybe somebody you love died, or it could be a grandfather. It doesn't have to be just mom and dad. So again, you had a perfect childhood, but somebody died that was very close to you. It impacted you, and you really don't realize it until later in life. And maybe you become scared to love because you love that person, and then they left, they went away, so these are things that manifest inside us. And there is a child us and there is the adult us, and many times when we struggle in life, it's because the child in us is still healing that wound. And when you were sharing your story about the generational patterns that continue to show up, so you can feel empathy and love for the person, like your father. That is a hard life. He didn't know any better. He then just did his best. In my case, I don't forgive my parents. That's a whole nother story, because I can't really say, anything like that. Like, that's pretty significant.
And if you don't know, go back and look at episode 4, right?
Yeah, episode 4. Yeah, you'll hear, and then you'll be like, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah. But, and I go on another tangent about, there's forgiveness and acceptance. And for those, like, you can forgive your father, he did his best and he had a story of his own, and then he just didn't know what he was doing. And then, but in my case, I just accepted, not forgave. But anyway, fast forward, I digress. But so how that transfers into your life, and then how that shows up for us as adults.
Yeah, I know for me, so, it did show up in my relationship. Fortunately, Chris was pretty astute and pretty aware of it, and we had open conversations about it. And so there were times I would feel like unworthy, of love, of being loved and so forth. And she would recognize it. We would work through it. So I think that was relatively kept in check. I think for me, though, it more showed up in my career. And to the people who I worked with, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, so, I excelled in my career. And part of what this did for me early on was I'm going to work hard. I'm going to prove myself. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I was a workaholic, but I certainly dug in, worked really hard, always trying to prove myself. So I would exceed goals at GE. I would get really great ratings and reviews. I would have the one-on-one dialogue with my leader, my manager, and it would be really well presented, and I should feel really good about it. But I'd walk out of the meetings like, okay, but I still need to work harder. Like, I'm still not good. And it just impacted me in terms of never feeling settled or always feeling more anxious. And then, what really happened to me then was, so after, she passed in those first few years, we were able to kind of handle it, but as I talked about in episode 3, right, things got really crazy. And how this manifested itself in me was, then it turned into paranoia, right? So then I was starting to feel like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing in this company. Like, where's my role? Like, and I started to get that paranoia on top of the anxiety. And ultimately, as I mentioned, I ended up being diagnosed as like clinically depressed, and I crashed. And it just, all those things left unchecked from my past came flooding back in, and it wreaked havoc on my system. It wasn't the only thing, but it certainly was a big part of why I ended up crashing in 2017.
Yeah, and that's your conscious and unconscious mind. So consciously, we think things, like, okay, that was good enough, or, we did good. We did good on the presentation. But then the unconscious mind is always talking to you until it's healed. And it's saying, well, was it really, though? Was it really good enough? Right. You could have done better. And so that's that childhood wound or that impact that happened. So that's where it keeps resurfacing until you do the work and heal that. Showed up for me similar. Personally, I always felt unloved, anxious, stressed all the time. Using my voice was huge. Like, that was, if I used my voice with my parents, that was a scary thing, because the result of me saying how I felt or anything, complaining or whatever, would be horrible. The impact that would come back. So then fast forward, how weird I end up in sales my whole life, and I have to use my voice. I have to stand in front of people. I'm now working with top executives and I have to present, and I'm terrified to use my voice. And I literally would, I tell everyone this, they witnessed it. I would end up with like hives all over my neck right before I had to speak, and like a lump in my throat. I felt like I was going to throw up. And then when I would get out there and speak, it was almost like I had to put that actress hat on that I was saying before in the other video, where I had to like go outside of myself to do this thing. And then I always would say like, I went into a coma because I don't know afterwards what I said, how did it sound, was I okay, did I do good enough? But if I stayed in the fear place, I would have not been able to do it. So and then using my voice, personally was scary, and the anxiousness and all of that. So,
yeah, I think so. Then what do you do with it, right? So and at that point in my life, I didn't I was aware of it. I knew about it. I could feel the anxiety. Had even sought help earlier in my life, when I first got in a relationship and stuff, and to try to help resolve it. But it was always kind of there. But here I am now. I've crashed, and we've talked about this before, but so I was on a path to healing, right? I was leaning into my faith, and God was showing up for me and kind of drawing me along this path to get my health back, get my mindset back, feeling a little bit more clarity around what I needed to do. And then it just became very apparent to me. It was right there. I have to go resolve this. It has impacted me for the first 50 years of my life. And I knew, and I was starting to really feel it, that I wasn't going to live the next 50 years the way I lived these 50. And in order to do that, I had to go figure this out. And, fortunately at that point in time, I had started to kind of shift into just a whole persona of gratitude, right? I was thankful that God kind of drew me, out when I was ready to go off the abyss or into the abyss, and had given me this opportunity to kind of, reset, reflect, renew, and heal. And at that point, my mind was shifting, and I started to really face into this, and said, you know what, I have to take care of this. I have to figure this out. And in that mindset of gratitude, I started to think, okay, well, so my birth mother, I can be upset at her or say, hey, she abandoned me or gave me up. But the reality is she gave me an opportunity at life, right? And, she had other options or whatever. But here she was being selfless, giving me up for adoption because she knew she couldn't raise me. So I was thankful for that. She gave me that opportunity. And then, my adoptive parents, right? They chose me, right? So rather than think about,
it's flipping the script.
Right.
It's literally flipping how you look at things.
Right. So what I didn't get, and we talked about, my parents, and they have their story and how they, they ended up being where they were and their capabilities maybe. But, I could look at them and say, thank you, right? Thank you for adopting me, giving me this opportunity, let me go to school, help me go to college, right? And then from there on, have a career and so forth. And in a different way too, I also looked at that and said, you know what, I don't, as much as I might respect them, I don't want that to be my relationship with my kids. I'm going to change that, right? I also don't want that to be necessarily maybe my relationship with my spouse. I'm going to change that. So those things did influence and impact me. But the final trigger, I think, and again, in a spirit of gratitude, was I could just forgive myself. It wasn't my choice. I was a baby, right, when all this stuff happened. So I could look and say, you know what, it wasn't your fault. You didn't choose this. You ended up being, put into the situation. You made the best of it. And here you are. It doesn't need to define you. Those tapes are played over and again for 50 years of your life. You need to stop it, and you can stop it. And by drawing it out, putting it on the table, and kind of dealing straight in with it, right, then you are able to kind of work through it. And every once in a while you'll feel it, there'll be a trigger or something will come back, but I'm aware of it now and be like, no. I'm not going to go down that path. I'm not going to let it dictate, in my relationships or how I communicate or with my kids or whatever. But again, it takes going through and really kind of diving in and to be able to kind of work your way through it. So.
Yeah. And what we do is we either repeat what we lived and learned, or we change it. Yeah. There's really not anything in the middle. And so you chose to change it and do better and different. I too did the same thing. again, it was exactly like you. You have to, when I was going through my journey, I'm like, okay, I have to have forgiveness. I have to have acceptance. I have to understand what happened and why, I repeated certain patterns in my life. So when I was crashing, I was like, I don't understand this. Why would I do this? Or why would I allow this? Or why do I feel this way? And then when it was presented to me, I had my aha moment where I broke down, and it was like this light switch went off, and I thought my whole life I've been told, like, you're the bad one, or it's your fault, or you're not capable, or whatever. And here, it had nothing to do with me. It was given to me. This is the blueprint we talk about. It was the story that was put on me. And now I have the capability to change all of that. And I never knew that, which sounds simple to some people. But to me, I just didn't know it. So then you go through the grieving, but then you get into gratitude. And, I can simply say that I'm grateful for some of the horrible experiences that happened, because it propelled me forward to where I'm at today and doing things differently. So.
Yeah. And it was, and I remember, it was a big part of what I had to do to heal. There was other things where I certainly had to grieve, Chris's loss and more, but it was a big part of it. And then once you come out on the other side,
there's peace,
right? There's peace, there's clarity, you feel inspired, right? And I think your
awareness, like you said, you will always have triggers. It's not like we're saying, okay, once you understand this, you're going to be great. You're always going to have triggers, but it's being aware of them, and you're like, oh, or having a partner in your life to point it out to you gently and say, hey, you're spiraling again, or you're going down this path. And then that's where, you take a step back and say, oh yeah, this feels familiar.
But it's a piece of you that is resolved now. And I think you come out now feeling healthy, a whole person, right? And we talked a lot about, living that life of joy. And I think you can now live that life of joy because you've resolved this, you've healed this. And I think now you're ready to kind of, okay, I'm going to go live my, how I want to live the rest of my life and so forth. So to me, I didn't know what origin story was at the time I was going through it. And now to kind of learn more about it and so forth, it's like, okay, like that makes a ton of sense, right? Yeah. And the fact that we all have it. And, I think we need to encourage everybody, right? Just kind of think through some of those things, right? That maybe have happened to you, and do you get triggered by certain things? And, how is it manifesting itself, showing up in your life now? So,
yeah. No, I have a quick story, and it's just an example, but I was coaching a grown man who was a president of a hospital, and he was experiencing some difficulty working with his the employees, doctors, whatever. And after a couple sessions, I realized that he was repeating to me certain patterns and behaviors and personalities that seemed to really bother him. And fast forward, once we unpeeled the onion a little bit, we learned that those personalities that were triggering him had to do with his father. And there was a lot of wounds there. So when we're talking about examples of our stuff, I also have examples. We talked to somebody the other day who had another story, completely different, but went all the way back to his childhood. We connected the dots for him, and he had never thought of it that way. So I think it's just it's interesting, like I said, once you hear about the origin story or how this impacts your life as an adult, and then once you connect the dots, you're like, oh my gosh, I can heal from this. I can move forward from this. I'm not stuck. I am not this life that was designed for me. Yeah. So it's exciting, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. Yeah. It's exciting. Yeah.
Do we have anything else to talk about? I think that
I think we covered it. That's what we wanted to cover. And again, we would just encourage, right, to think through if there are things that are bothering you that have always kind of felt like they're there. The first thing I think each of us did when we kind of came to that point was we sought help, right? And we had help along in that journey to get there. So would encourage you to do that and to dig in a little bit deep. And it may be a little bit painful kind of going through it, but the end result, like we said, is this kind of feeling whole again, and a life of, joy and so forth, and living the way you want to live, and not feeling like you're being
whole
held
health.
Back.
Yes,
so.
And it's never too late. We're in our mid-50s, and
some more than that.
We did some of the work just a couple of years ago. Even if you're in your 40s, it's never too late. Just think of all the years ahead of you that you can live and live free from the story and the pain and the stuff that you've carried forward unknowingly. So,
all right. Well, thank you for your time, and hope you enjoyed it. And we will see you on the next one.
See you soon.
Take care. Thank you for listening in to this episode of the His and Her Life Hacks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. We look forward to having you join us on future episodes. If there's a topic that you would like Dawne and I to discuss, please feel free to contact us at dawn.jacoby@grit2grace.com or larry.ambrose@grit2grace.com. See you on the next one.